All right, welcome everyone. Really excited for our next presentation here. Joining me, you'll see, is Brian McGoff. My name is Dustin Adkison. So let's jump in real quick to our slides. Brian's our the global business unit executive for IBM Data Science and AI. I've had the pleasure of working with Brian now for better part of a decade. Really great guy if you've not met him. Great person to ask questions to, and really someone who's incredibly familiar with the data science and AI landscape, as well as the IBM environment as a whole. So really excited he was able to join us today and provide a presentation. Before we jump into the details of his presentation, I want to quickly just talk a little bit more about the app, provide some logistics for anyone who was not in the keynote a bit earlier. So our app is Whova this year, and Whova is really a tool that's designed to allow more collaboration, more ways to build your own agenda, to interact with your peers. During this session, please use the Q&A area to ask questions. We covet your questions. We want to have the Q&A at the end. Feel free to post them during the presentation. If we see them, we'll try to pause and answer your questions live. But we'll be sure to address as many as we can at the end of the presentation with time permitting. Also want to talk a little bit about the giveaway. So for attendees of this session in particular, Ingram is sponsoring a Gucci card case giveaway. So really excited to have all these fun giveaways for the day. So be sure to attend, tell your friends to attend, and let's see who the winner is. We're going to announce this tomorrow morning prior to the start of the event tomorrow. Again, the grand prize, it was actually a misprint in the keynote, so it's not a Yeti cooler. It's a 14-piece, really nice travel collection. Again, this is sponsored by Ingram. This is based on attending today's session, so being here, you're getting one entry. Any IBM session that you attend, you'll get one entry. And then we'll have our drawing to see who the lucky winner is. This will be announced at the end of the event. So with that, I'm going to hand things off to Brian to share.
Dustin, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. Good morning, everybody. So today, why we have our time together this morning, what I'd like to do is take a step back from products and technology in general for a minute and talk about kind of what organizations had done to adapt that we saw during the pandemic. And, as they kind of adapted to the new normal, how some of them emerged and not only survived it, but also thrived, and what examples we found the leaders had versus what examples we found some of the organizations and companies that struggled a little bit, what they had in common. So that's really the basis for today's talk. And as Dustin said, if you have any questions along the way, feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll answer them as we go, or certainly at the end. I guess the first thing is as far as who was impacted, everybody, right? We saw early on in the first quarter of the year, and then certainly by June, August, that every organization around the world, whether it was a private institution or local governments, everybody was impacted by this. Banking and finance organizations had to rapidly adapt risk models for their, especially on the consumer side, and figure out where their biggest exposures were on line of business as people started looking at long-term unemployment or underemployment. And they also, because of the massive shift to work from home, they had a lot of technology and challenges within the workforce on how to manage people and ensure quality and security and all these things. And as they were closing branches, they also had to decide how fast or they could roll out digital engagement for their clients to replace them. And then the other thing that was very interesting in talking about the banking industry for a minute, financial institutions found that in 2020, especially in late 2020, when there was a lot of feedback and surveys being done, the commercial banking customers' preferences changed during the pandemic. For the first time ever, the digital experience was more important to commercial banking customers than customer service. on respondents. And then I thought another interesting thing, there was a large jump in respondents in 2020, late 2020, that said that they would now trust, Facebook and Google and Amazon and Apple to manage their banking needs. And that was, there was always a small percentage of folks that indicated that, but it was a large jump. I believe it was north of 7% in 2020. And I'm actually really looking forward to see what that is. So banks needed to stop looking within their own industry for service offerings and competition, and needed to start looking outside to where client preference was. Commercial institutions, they had to really quickly reevaluate their portfolios as well, especially things like securities that were backed by commercial real estate, when they saw that there was going to be long-term gaps, and some very large organizations started letting leases go. And, insurance companies, of course, had to utilize, more advanced data and analytics needs that they may not had to do things like state level audits on rebates and things for auto insurance and those things, where they refunded some money to consumers because they weren't utilizing the products as much. Travel and hospitality, as you guys can imagine, took a huge hit. But one of the things I thought was interesting is that even though tourism is still down significantly, the hotel industry announced recently that they're going to actually operate long-term, so back after what they would consider emerging from in the sustaining post-pandemic recovery. They're going to operate, especially in the U.S. They gave a number of 500,000 fewer people are going to be working in the U.S. hotel industry. So there's going to, that's going to tell you they're going to have to be a lot of automation and a lot of improved processes to allow that to happen. And then, of course, airlines, huge impact. I mean, even though they had a 300+% growth June of this year over last year, June of last year was horrible, right? The numbers look pretty good for them right now, but it's interesting that only about 31% of business travel has recovered so far. And the interesting, business travel only made up 12 or 13% of the airline passengers, 2019 and prior, but they were 2.5 to 3 times more profitable. So the airline industry is going to have to go through some major shifts or reimagine business models to increase profitability on what is now their majority customer base. Cruise lines, we worked with a lot of them early on to decide what they could do to help recover costs or reduce costs. In transportation, the railroad industry, which was already kind of experiencing a micro recession in 2019, we're planning to recover in the first half of 2020. And obviously we all know how that went, as well as retail and distribution impacts. I mean, one of the things I found most interesting in the retail space is there are now just under 8 million online retailers, which is a significant increase over 2019. So looking at that a little bit, online retail sales represented 101% of all the gains in retail in 2020, which means that all of those traditional channels had negative growth. So they had experienced a decline. And a lot of them that we spoke with, and a lot of the Deloitte and McKinsey articles that came out even in the last 3 months, are saying that a lot of those traditional retail channels don't expect to recover until 2024, 2025. So 40% of them are not experiencing or not expecting to go back to pre-pandemic levels anytime soon. And then big box retailers, it all did incredibly well. The DIY stores and stuff, as we all decided to do home improvement projects while we were home more, they had issues with supply chain. I mean, they couldn't keep up with demand, and any inefficient or suboptimal workflows that they had were completely exposed, and there were a lot of areas where those actually experienced collapse. So they had a lot of challenges in keeping up with that newfound demand. Governments, obviously, we know that, again, the same inefficient processes and things were exposed. Pharmacies and healthcare were taxed. I thought it was interesting, the pharmacy chains we work with, they found they couldn't use the phone anymore. They went from getting, 100 phone calls a day inbound to one pharmacy chain we spoke with. Each individual store was experiencing between 5,000 and 8,000 inbound phone calls a day. which made it impossible for them to use the phone to communicate with healthcare providers and physicians and the like. And it's incredible how they adapted so quickly. Manufacturing, which was already going through kind of a digitization effort or an automation effort, they obviously had to step that up. So where they had, as Rob mentioned in his keynote, if you heard it this morning, where they had a multi-year plan for these things, they had to accelerate those plans and crush them down into months and weeks. And then, of course, telco, which became the backbone of connecting the work from anywhere environments that we found ourselves in, again, had to rapidly increase the timelines on their investments in automation and AI and those things to keep that demand and that growth running, especially with because it coincided with the rollout of 5G services. And that's not over, because work from anywhere is going to be permanent for a lot of folks, and those telco organizations will be one of the primary support organizations for that, and they'll have to be partnering with us to make sure that as we work from anywhere that it's a secure environment. A lot of young people don't own homes. They live in condominiums and apartments, and a lot of people in general do, and use things like shared Wi-Fi resources and the like, which is not a great place to be passing personal health information or PII related to your role within your company. So, how did organizations survive? I think that, and again, just to give you some background, in the last year and a half, I worked on this kind of strategy and, strategizing as well as planning for modernization with about 400 companies, and varying degrees, but I got very involved with quite a few. And what I've noticed is that the leaders were able to very quickly adapt and, execute on strategies to the great digital shift. They didn't hesitate. They, kind of planned things out quickly. They found good partners, and they recognized right away that this was something they were going to have to do. They also had a critical focus on modernization that included quantifiable savings. They didn't do anything based on having the technology or the push to a certain platform. They made sure that there was a quantifiable value with each step they took. And what I mean by that is they moved to, mobile or digital environments. They made sure that they did so in a planned way, where they were deprecating and reducing the amount of legacy environments or legacy technologies that were costly. And in doing that, a lot of them saved anywhere from hundreds of thousands to tens of millions of dollars during that modernization effort. Some keys to them reimagining their business models were really, I've listed a few here. Communication. I noticed that the real winners were very clearly communicating with all their stakeholders and their employees and their customers about what they were doing, why, how long it was going to take. There was a lot of good listening. I noticed there was a lot of real-time experiential feedback initiatives. Consumer banking, as an example, insurance, healthcare providers were changing the way that they gathered information from their consumers and their citizens to make sure that they understood what their, the demand shifts and the new preferences that they'd have to adapt to. And this is different. I mean, the way we did it in the past, we sent surveys out, they'd come back. It was a multi-month process. There was a lot of listening being done now, incorporating social media or social media-like constructs, where it was more of a, real-time and detailed feedback. So more verbatim or based versus predetermined measures on a survey. And it was empowerment. I think that one of the other things that got recognized very early when people worked in a distributed environment is did everybody have the right technology to work at the top of their professional license, regardless of what it was? So there was a lot of technology investment made in people and organization or divisions to make sure that everybody was able to do higher value work. And then, of course, automation, which we talked about earlier. Key industries, they had to adapt the workforce and the processes, as we said, to levels that mere humans couldn't do. So they had to, we'll call it forced automation for things Think about the pharmacies, for example. There's no way to handle those phone calls, right? So they had to route them to digital services, whether it was AI chatbots or some other service that would allow them to respond and engage with the consumers, as well as maintain the levels of communication required for the rest of their business. And, I don't know if you're familiar with S-curves, but one of the things that I want to, in order to describe how it changed, I want to tell you how it used to go. So if you're not familiar with an S-curve, this is kind of the traditional model that we followed in startup world. And a lot of times we do this now in all organizations, how we approach a new transformation. So over a period of time, usually, a years, we invest in something, and we kind of, if you look at, all systems kind of follow a pattern, right? So we make that initial investment, and then we grow that investment, we hit peak performance, and then it declines. And the way it usually plays out, and again, I've done a few startups in my life, you make your investment and it's early and you're kind of saying to yourself, it's okay. It hasn't gained traction yet. Stay the course, it's early. And then you get to a point of doubt where, you kind of say, oh, what have we done? Is this a huge mistake? And then there's a little bit of an uptick. We start gaining performance, and we're like, we have something, we've made a profit. This is incredible. And then, of course, during the decline, we want to blame somebody, or we go, oh my God, what happened? We're done for. Well, again, good organizations that look at different transformations like this have kind of this idea of S-curves where they are investing at peak, so that as the decline of that first transformation falls off, they're at the peak of the next S-curve. And this is the way that we've traditionally operated of all kinds of systems for many, many years. And what COVID did is it forced us to have multiple business transformations in a very short period of time, nested within an existing business cycle or business transformation. And that was a challenge. And in doing so, we had to change the way that we approached implementing, resources and technology, as well as how we invested. And if we look at the kind of traditional cycle of operating within a crisis, there's kind of there were always these three modes. There's survival mode, there's manage, and then we emerge. And I've added a fourth mode now, which I think is sustain. But during survival mode, which we found ourselves in early 2020, organizations around the world had to cut operational expense. They had to cut anywhere from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands to some of the airlines we work with had to cut $1 billion in expense. So there was this construct of cut to affordability. How do I manage my business? What can I cut? What can I cut down to be able to keep the business alive and still, run the business or try and transform out of this? And those cut to affordability actions actually drove a lot of modernization, because some of the areas we quickly uncovered with clients was legacy systems, redundant technologies. An example is we have plenty of organizations we found had, north of 20 or 25 business intelligence tools, many of which did the same thing. And they were just acquired through, various methods over time. And when you added up the maintenance and the licensing over the top of that, and the inefficiency of a single analytics workflow and somebody going through 3 or 4 tools to do it, the time that they had spent moving that data from one phase to the next, from a data acquisition to visualization to exploration to pattern gathering and reporting and predictive. If they were moving it through 4 or 5 different tools to do that, that added up to a lot of inefficient time and a lot of lost hours. One of the large retailers we found was able to cut over 125,000 hours of unproductive time just by changing from 5 different tools to do a single analytics workflow process down to a single advanced analytics platform. So a single place where they could kind of click through those workflows within the same environment versus constantly pulling data out and running it through data blending and munging routines to move it to the next phase. And then again, we saw that consistent. Some of the airlines we work with, in much simpler use cases, we found a gain back of 61,000 hours of time a year. And again, it didn't take much. It was saving, every knowledge worker an hour to an hour and a half, per month, and not having to do that. And when you add that up over the number of knowledge workers in those organizations, it added up to tens of thousands, and in many cases, hundreds of thousands of hours, as well as significant savings in licensing and support because of their ability to implement platforms, a fewer number of platforms, and replace those products. We also saw this in not just BI tools, but integration and planning and a lot of other areas where there was a lot of redundant software, which happens, especially if you've been around a long time. And those were great ways for us to fund the modernization and transformation and that shift to digital, by finding those areas that we could very quickly implement modern platforms with clients and allow them to get rid of those old systems, and in many cases those old and expensive systems, as well as improve the efficiency of how those users that use them work. We were able to actually create the digital transformation at a fraction of the cost of how they were operating today. And there's some really good examples, and a lot of them are still happening. I mean, obviously, some of the very large organizations, it's going to take time. But again, as we stated in the last talk, is by doing it in sprints versus looking at it as a marathon, we were able to gain some of that value very early on. And I guess again, as we readjust the timeline, we continue to shift into the digital. I think there's going to be a fourth phase. I think that as we emerge from the disruptions from the pandemic, there's going to be a sustained, phase. And I think that phase will be driven by a lot of innovation and leadership in organizations. I think that in looking at the banking example, where people are now willing to have Apple and Google and other tech organizations become their financial institution, I think there's a lot of other examples like that which are going to pop up. And that's going to really quickly identify who the leaders are in various industries and how they'll adapt to meet those new challenges, or those new competitive challenges. So I'd like to give you some of the top observations I found, again, in working with all these organizations. The leaders in the space, what I found, they had quickly reimagined the business models based on, again, the feedback, the listening, the engagement, working, and being transparent communication with their employees and stakeholders, and they acted on them very quickly. They took action to outfit the business with the right technology based on the new normals, and they adopted to these new processes well. Which isn't always easy, because a lot of people, sometimes they love the way they do things, and you're asking them to completely forget about that and change. So there was a lot of, inspirational leadership that took place early on to communicate what was at stake and why they had to do it. I also noticed that a lot of the winners in this had the right technology partners. And what I mean by that, they picked a partner who very clearly had, automation and methodologies to do this transformation, but they weren't just delivering what the client needed right then and there. They were satisfying the immediate need, but it was very clear that those partners also had a strategy or technology and automation that was a year or two ahead of where the client was. And what that meant was, as the client went through that first curve of transformation, or that micro S curve, that shortened period of time, that as the client or the industry, the customer was ready for that next transformation, that partner was waiting for them. They weren't, kind of catching up together. They picked partners, and they picked technology and implementation and service partners like PM Square that were kind of ahead of them and had a plan in place for the next 3 transformations that needed to take place in order for them to not only, survive, but manage, emerge, and then of course sustain leadership throughout this whole cycle. And then a lot of when work from anywhere also uncovered a lot of people that just didn't have the technology they needed to work at the top of their profession. So there was a lot of enabling, knowledge workers or people that, were making decisions and running critical parts of the business with better tools and technology. The other thing that we saw a lot of, if they weren't doing that quickly enough, especially the newer parts, the younger parts of the workforce, they were bringing technology to work with them. They were bringing in open source tools. They were utilizing other technology that wasn't given to them or provided to them by the corporations to do their job. And while that seems interesting, and we all know there's the whole Python native demographic out there, it was creating risk, and it was well-intentioned risk, right? So it was the idea that they were bringing these advanced technologies to work smarter and work better, but they didn't necessarily have auditability, and they weren't complying to things like CCPA and GDPR and DPA and all these other data privacy or regulatory things that corporate governance is concerned with, that maybe that worker isn't. So somebody that was knitting together a process on their own with Python and BERT and Airflow, they're not going to go and set up Airflow operators for Lineage, right? They're just going to go and pull the information together and provide the output. And frankly, it looks great in a lot of cases. It's very insightful, but it's not easily audited or governed if for any reason we need to go back and explore that. And I think a lot of regulatory fines that we saw and a lot of violation errors that we found in 2020 and 21 we've made that very clear that was happening and what those risks were. There were tens of millions in dollars worth of fines levied in late 2020 and early 2021. There's a lot that are still being negotiated, but it was because as we over-rotated a little bit in the technology side without thinking of governance, security, or maybe we didn't have the right partners. It created as much exposure as it did efficiency. So that was just something to keep an eye on. The other thing too is I noticed AI works, right? We noticed that very early on, especially with like COVID hotlines and HR hotlines, where we applied chatbots and intelligent AI customer service support, that customers, patients, citizens of local governments, they will interact with a chatbot if it answers their questions, and they will respond and very positively. We noticed very quickly that AI was capable of managing a large number of tasks within our organizations that we were working with. It allowed resources to focus on higher level work. Everything from trial preparation and contract review in the legal industry, institutional investment research. I mean, a great example of this is in working with Goldman Sachs years ago. I mean, I used to have 200 plus folks on the trading desk. As of today, I think they have 2 that manage digital workers. HR onboarding tasks, budget and planning. You heard. Maybe heard Mike McGee answer some questions in the last session's Q&A, talking about people adopting and feeling more comfortable with automated budget and planning, or AI assisted or predictive budget and planning. Those things worked very well. Disease mapping and disease management with AI, credit approvals and denials. And again, the leaders in that space, I don't know if any of you are familiar with Amazon, actually has billions of dollars in loans that they put out for their merchants, for merchant services and their seller services, and they're using AI-assisted credit approvals, and they're using and denials, and they're not using traditional credit scores and debt ratios of those folks. They're using what we would consider non-traditional data sources, by enough so that feel comfortable they've increased the signal in that data to allow the AI to make those decisions. And it's allowing them to do it very quickly. And Apple's doing similar things, as well as some of the leading consumer financial institutions are starting to get into that as well. But there are things we have to watch. There are gaps, and I love, like if you've ever ridden the subway in London, they always are announcing "Mind the Gap." As we shift and look at AI, we did notice that there were these gaps in information. So we needed, in order for the AI to work, effectively, there were a lot of things that had to be enhanced, and it was, endpoints and again, secure data transports, integration with apps and the ecosystem in order to get the information that the AI needed to make those effective decisions. Legacy applications in particular, storage management, data management silos. I mean, we had to make the right information rich and enriching the AI, and it wasn't easy for a lot of folks. There was a very large gap, and that's where, if you saw these compressed transformation curves, that's where a lot of that time was spent, and that's where those partners were engaging with the organizations to ensure that they were addressing those kind of in parallel, which is why we talk a lot about AI infused applications as a way to get started. And then over time, you build out your data fabric or your platforms to ensure that you've addressed these things holistically for the future of your full digital transformation. And then, in shortening the gaps, we, as I just stated, there was a lot of strategies, data fabric strategies or hybrid cloud, multi-cloud platform strategies that made that a lot easier. And we saw a number of organizations take advantage of that very early on and are in process right now of experiencing those benefits. And along the way, I think that when I think of data fabric and the strategy of laying out a data fabric or a hybrid cloud platform in general, we learn a lot about what other inefficiencies or what other processes we need to update. I think that it also allows us to reduce a significant amount of technical debt. I thought it was interesting, a lot of the modernization around reporting or BI in order to reduce all that redundant software, we found almost all the organizations had anywhere from hundreds or thousands of reports and visualizations and objects or data objects that they just weren't using anymore. They were still supporting them. They were creating, infrastructure space and supporting licenses and things of products that were just not being used. And it's because their business had transformed so many times since they initially built those that they became invalid and they'd moved on to other things. But they never took a hard look at or auditing or looking at those old visualizations and reports and even those old data assets to see that they should have actually been sunset. So there was a lot of savings gained along the way as they laid out these strategies. And then, of course, cloud adoption whenever possible, being able to move everything to the cloud has been of a great benefit. No, I can't believe anybody who's listening today is thinking of moving to a single cloud vendor. So in all this, having a hybrid cloud or multi-cloud strategy, of course, is going to be important. And then, in general, as you're mapping things out, create a system map of all those different, critical areas to see where you're losing hours. Is the technology causing inefficiencies? Is the process causing inefficiencies? In other words, get down to root cause. A lot of times what we saw in companies that really had significant gains in these areas, there were issues where the technology was causing the inefficiency because they were using a very specific technology for exploration or discovery of data sets, where had they used that feature within an enterprise platform, it may not have been their preference tool, but it would give them back anywhere from dozens to hundreds of hours. So those things are important to map out and clearly kind of lay out as you go down your path to modernization. Other things worth mentioning. I think that the real the best case clients that I got to work with, they recognize the importance of emotional agility in this. There was a large financial institution I got involved with very early on. And when we proposed our modernization plan, there was one particular person who just was really not going to hear of it. He described their last major upgrade or consolidation and how it cost them, millions and millions of dollars and took well over a year. And as I was listening to his issues, I was thinking, like, it just didn't sound right. And then I asked, well, when was this? And he described it, the process exactly how it would have taken place 25 years ago. And this was not like silly, this was real to him, right? So his experience in that was going to prevent him from buying into any modernization effort that involved a certain class of tools or technologies within the organization. And rather than disrupting the process, this guy really became my hero, because I think what he was verbalizing was what a lot of his peers were thinking. And it allowed us to really open up that level of discussion and talk about how automation has progressed and how the technologies in general have progressed to avoid those very things that cost them so much money and so much pain, when he, and what he was describing. The other thing is, the key stakeholders in these transformations, and the best ones I've seen, had a defined consensus for these initiatives, and it was explicit. And when I talk about consensus, it wasn't that they all agreed on everything. I mean, it was defined in such a way that they said, for those things we agree on, great, but for those that you don't agree with me, can you live with this? And they really did a good job at declaring what was at stake if they didn't do this, and made sure that the teams involved, including the partners and the technology vendors, had a definition of what they could, what consensus was. And it wasn't that we all have to agree, because if that's the goal, that we all have to agree across the various stakeholders in the organization, things will never happen, right? It'll not move forward. So I think define consensus where you map out how you're going to, come to terms with the decision-making process early was key. And then, of course, senior leadership's declaring what was at stake. This is what, they were very transparent that if we don't do this and we don't do it quickly, this is the result. This is what's going to happen. And it was not good, right? So it got everybody to kind of bought in and behind it. And there was this visible integrity. And I say that because I've noticed the ones that had the most success and really realized the returns, the financial returns that we put in up front, they were the ones that, when they said they were going to do something, they did it. And they didn't, they didn't waffle or waver on anything. So as they met their timelines with their partners, their vendors, and the organization, and it was very obvious in working with those clients. And one of the things that was obvious in that was that they had these date certain outcomes. When they set a date to do something, everybody worked towards that date, and that date didn't move unless there were some instances where it had to. But for the most part, when they set dates for things, it was expected that their team would meet that date. Again, there was a consensus gathered on those dates early on, but they expected the partners and the technology vendors to meet those dates as well, if there was additional functionality or integration work needed. And then, of course, leaders pick the right partners. And this comes back to, those partners that had these, models and automation and approach to this, but also had years ahead of, plans and technology. And that automation was not just, again, meeting today's need, but the need a year from now or 2 years from now. So that organization could grow into multiple transformations to move to the next level, so beyond emerging, but sustaining their business and growing their business under this new normal. So I just, in all this, there's one other thing that I think about is we have to think about like inspiration. And when I was thinking about the pandemic, I was thinking about some organizations I've worked with in the past, where somebody had, a personal and business crisis and had to work through it. And I used to work with a company that involved working with this designer, Michael Graves. And I think about the time I was working with him, what he went through. This is an architect, designer, industrial designer, who was at the top of his game when he had a spinal infection while he was on a business trip that led to paralysis. He was wheelchair bound within 2 years. And he spent, those 2 years of the progression of this in the hospital. And what was interesting is, we talk about multiple transformations, that to keep his business going, to keep his mind going, to keep himself going, he completely redesigned all the horrible things he experienced while he was in the hospital. Poorly designed wheelchairs, chairs, tables, beds, rooms, hospitals itself. He actually, one of the rehab centers he was in Nebraska, he redesigned it completely from his bed out to the parking lot, and then gifted it to them after, which they built. It actually exists. It's in Lincoln, Nebraska. And And he created new products. He transformed his design business into a healthcare design business, working with Stryker medical devices primarily, and designed a whole line of Michael Graves designed, healthcare products, and they were hugely profitable and successful. And it was the idea that the worst things, started happening to this person, and he was able to, transform very quickly multiple times during that process, and emerged, with a phenomenal business, growing his business and himself at the other end. And I say that because I think we all have to find kind of inspiration as we take on what are these very hard tasks. And I think this is my example, having gotten to work with him at that time. And I'm sure everybody else has an example. But bring these examples to work with you. Let people know that, yes, this is hard work and it requires focus and a lot of change, but give them the examples that you have personally or that you've read about, that let them know that, success could be even greater on the other side of this as we embrace it. So with that, I apologize. I went a little long. I wanted to leave some time for questions. If you can put them in the chat, or Dustin, maybe you could field a few.
Yeah, Brian, that was excellent. You've got a ton of questions here. So yeah, so that was an excellent presentation. First question: what has been the most notable shift in what executives are asking of IBM through the pandemic?
Save us money. We don't. It's funny. Like one of my first client engagements I got involved in was with a cruise line and an airline as the pandemic was setting in, and they were each losing billions of dollars a month in some cases, and I was tasked with going in and working with them, and working with the sales team. What are you going to sell somebody who's losing billions of dollars? So we broke down every component for a 15-minute phone call. Myself and the team, we spent 3.5 hours each breaking down and reading every line item of their union contracts to identify their knowledge workers, populations, what tools they were using. And we came back to each of those organizations with a plan to save them tens of millions of dollars in reduced software costs. And not just with us, like with everybody, and showed them, various inefficiencies and how to reduce technical debt. And we didn't, in that process, obviously we talked about moving into some more modern platforms, some of which were ours, but it was all in context of saving them money. And I believe the first airline I worked with, the overall savings over the 3-year period we laid out was north of $70 million. The cruise lines was a little different because we also had to adapt their customer service lines with AI assisted, workers because of the sheer volume of calls. Their issue on that side of their business was just keeping up with demand of all the people trying to rebook or cancel, or had questions around how their prepaid cruise line experience was going to be treated. And those were that was really the theme for the first year, and it continues to be the theme, but it's a little different now. It's about how to quantify value in doing something new, but it's still the same work goes into it.
Awesome. Next up, how can AI help testing a hybrid web app like IBM Cognos?
I think that if you look at the AI infused features in Cognos, I think that I don't know about testing, but I mean, I use AI assisted functions in Cognos every day as part of my business, as well as in planning analytics. I mean, we painstakingly go through forecasting, revenue and resource deployments and all these things. But I got news for you. We have these AI, performance view budgets and things, and they're always right. We could put hours and days into it, but let me tell you, the AI is 90% of the time smarter than I am, or any with the collective.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
All right. Shortening the gap isn't always high priority. What are the long-term effects if it is not addressed? That's a good one.
The big red dot at the end of an S-curve transformation is when you pack it up and go home. I mean, it's unfortunate, but if we don't do these things, in a timely enough fashion. In some cases, it becomes too late, and we unfortunately saw that with some clients where they waited too long and their business, wound down, or they, had to quickly merge with someone else. And we see that with, it doesn't matter what the industry is. If you're not addressing the transformation, quickly and progressing towards, again, and you can take small steps, but progressing towards that digitization, it can come to a point where it's too late.
Yeah, we've unfortunately seen that as well. All right, next question. What's the best way to embark on an analytics tool consolidation effort? Oh boy, that one was written for you, clearly.
So I have a favorite, and my way of doing this confuses a lot of people, but Dustin, you've experienced it, right? So what I do is, when I'm going to go talk to somebody about analytics tool consolidation or any tool consolidation, the team and I, we spend hours going through every digital piece of information on that company. So we look at all the news articles. I mentioned, like, for the airlines and government, it's easy. We go through union and procurement contracts. I go through resumes of every contractor that's worked at that company in the last 18 months, the profiles in LinkedIn of every employee that's worked at that company in the last 18 months. I don't look at anything beyond that because I don't think that information would be relevant anymore. And I go through the careers page and I look at all the job postings and I break them down by what the skill set requirement is for those jobs. And a couple of things come out of that. Through the news articles, I see what their publicly stated declaration is for modernization and transformation as they try and manage in the pandemic. The careers page tells me, are they serious about it? So I just worked with a company last week where they had some stated, transformations around AI and digital banking and serving new populations with digital only products. And then I noticed on their careers page, 51.5% of all the jobs were for AI, machine learning, advanced analytics, right? So they clearly were investing in those stated goals. And then I went through their LinkedIn profiles, resumes, all these other data sources, again, only focused on what was current in 18 months. And I was able to give them a full list of all the technology their employees were using. And it's a list they'd never seen before. They stated that they had 5 business intelligence tools. Our data proved, not showed, but proved, because we could show them where we got the information, they had 23. We showed which ones they were paying for, which ones were open source use. Out of all the 23, there were 14 that had licenses or support included with it, or subscription or committed term licensing. And we said, listen, you could pick up $5 million here every year by, reducing these overlapping ones from 14 to 3. Budget planning and forecast software, they thought they had 2 different technologies. They had 5. Integration, they had 11. There was, you keep going, right? And the idea was that we were able to pick a modernization path, allow them to evaluate a small number of enterprise platforms for these areas, and then all that additional capital and resource associated with it, like infrastructure and lost time. If you're using, again, 5 products to do a single analytics workflow, you're moving data 4 and 5 times. You're burning an hour and a half a month. Some clients will tell us that's a day. That's tens of thousands of hours for a decent sized company. And that's how I do it. And then we lay out the plan. We let them come back and say, we agree with you. These are the platforms we think make sense for us going forward. We try and align them with the right partner to help them get there and show them what the best practices are to break down the technology, consolidation itself, moving those reports, reducing all those things that aren't being used that you're supporting.
Yeah, we've seen a big uptick in that type of request from our clients, just as we've seen things where these previously siloed tools get handed off to IT whenever they get too big for the business to manage. And then IT's first thought is, well, I don't want to manage 7 tools or 8 tools. So,
Dustin, you've seen the outputs of a lot of these. What was your feedback from clients? Did they go, oh my gosh, or,
Yeah, I'd say almost every client was surprised to see the number of tools that they had. Depending on who we're talking with, if we're talking with someone within like the IT or the analytics team, they're often not really sure how to go about getting rid of all the extra tools. And that's an area we can certainly help drive those conversations. Typically, it starts with trying to get a some buy-in from one of your leadership team or an executive sponsor to help look at how do you consolidate all these tools.
I always try and have a finance partner. We got sideways on some of the or perceived barriers, and with one of the airlines, and the person that worked for the CFO got on the call and said, I understand you don't want to do this, but you better come up with $48 million of reasons why not by Monday. Yeah. And it pushed the deal along, pushed the project along, and in some cases, I mean, when you look at the numbers, it saves jobs, it saves companies when you do it right.
Yeah. So we have a lot of more questions. So I'll probably take a couple more, and then we'll do our lunch networking break. But what advice can you give to help an organization embrace analytics with so many other projects distractions going on?
I hate to sound like a broken record, but quantify the value. When you can list the financial value of certain analytics areas in your business, it makes a big impact. If I came to you and said, I'd like to talk to you about, embracing, discovery process in your BI environment with Cognos, or if I came to you with the same goal and said, I'd like to talk to you about, cutting $10 million in operational expense every year, you have 15 minutes. Which call are you going to take?
Yeah. There's one. I was going to say, I want to make sure we share that one because I love it. Can you come to speak at my company? You make a very strong argument with a winky face. Be careful whoever asked that, because he probably would.
I did. I engaged with 400. So we did work research profiles on 400 companies since April, May of 2020. I'm involved directly in working with about 25% of them, and I talk to them all the time. And most of the time, they have me back. Sometimes not, because it's there's hard truths involved, but absolutely anytime.
Excellent. I think we probably are running a little low on time, so we might jump back over to what's coming next. Just make sure we give people a chance for a break prior to the networking lunch. For anyone who was looking at the questions, remember to upvote if you like a question, because we try to make sure we're pulling in the ones that have the most upvotes. So coming up next, we've got our networking lunch. We're trying to give these 10-minute breaks between sessions, so I'll try to wrap up this slide in the next 2 minutes. And then, again, try to show up on time for the networking lunches. That's going to give you a chance to get on one of the first tables, to get in one of the first rotations, and we rotate through who you're with. Feel free to be on camera eating, because I'm going to be. And then after lunch, we're going to have our execution track will be focused on the future of multi-cloud management using IBM Cloud Pak for data. That's going to be presented by IBM. And then I believe that's Kaz from IBM, I believe will be presenting that. And then our focal point session will be going mobile, taking your insights on the roads. This is looking at Cognos Mobile, and I believe that is Ryan Dolly from our team who will be presenting there. And then after that, the focal point session will be modernizing analytics platforms, looking at Cognos Analytics roadmaps. Again, that's presented by IBM. Notice that these aren't all of the sessions. These are the ones associated with our track. So these are the Cognos specific sessions, IBM Cognos Analytics specific sessions coming up. Our next Cognos Analytics Genius Bar slot is also today at 1:30 Eastern. So if you missed your chance to pick Cognos Paul's brain earlier, there will be another opportunity to pick someone else's brain at 1:30 Eastern. And with that, we'll give everyone a 10-minute break before go grab some lunch and get it ready so you can be in those networking lunches and have your food in front of you. All right, thanks everyone.